So let's say that we want to formalize this and have a macro that we can use on demand there. What we will do is first go to our View menu. Step 2, we'll click the top portion of the Macros command to bring up the Macro dialog box. Step 3 there, where it says Macros In, we'll want to choose personal.xlsb. Now, in the event that personal.xlsb does not appear on this space here, that means you've not yet used the macro recorder, which means in turn you then don't have yet a personal macro workbook. The reason we want to put this in the personal macro workbook is so that this macro will always be available to us, so we can then use it universally when we need to, when we run into a problem with a workbook there. So I will show you when we get to Excel how to start and stop the macro recorder if needed to create this macro. But if you already have a personal macro workbook, you can then create a new macro from the macro dialog box. Notice that we will give it a name. We'll call it Reset Worksheet, or you could give it a different name, but I'll use the name Reset Worksheet. Cannot have any spaces in my macro name. Step 5 there, I will click Create. So what will then happen is the Visual Basic Editor will appear for me on the screen, and a module sheet will appear, and the beginning and ending of the macro will appear. The words sub will appear, that's short for subroutine, and the word end sub, that means that's the end of the subroutine. So in between there, I'll just type in there ActiveSheet.UsedRange. Again, capitalization doesn't matter, and in this context, we'll see that if we type that in and move our cursor down, so we just tap the down arrow key or press the enter key to create a blank row, then we'll find that Excel will formally capitalize it. That's a way of double checking to make sure that we did type that line of code correctly. From there, we can go to the File menu. Step 8, we want to save the Personal Macro Workbook. Important to go ahead and save it from inside the Visual Basic Editor, because what happens in Excel when you're closing your workbooks, Excel is going to say, do you want to save this? Do you want to save this? Do you want to save this? If you have multiple documents open, one of those do you want to save is going to be for the Personal Macro Workbook. And if you blow through that dialog box too quickly, then you'll throw away your macro. That's why if I'm going to make a change to the Personal Macro Workbook, I like to go ahead and use that Save command that appears on the File menu within the Visual Basic Editor. I can then close and return to Microsoft Excel. So notice I do not have to unhide the Personal Macro Workbook to create a new macro. I do have to unhide the Personal Macro Workbook if I want to edit an existing macro or delete an existing macro, but there is an opportunity to create a new macro just by clicking the Create button and not having to go and formally unhide the Personal Macro Workbook in this situation. In Excel, if we have the Developer menu displayed, there is a Macros button here which we can click, or we can go to the View menu and click the top portion of the Macros command there as well. So when we click that, notice it shows us any macros in our workbook, and if we come down, if we see personal.xlsb there, that means that we have a personal macro workbook. Now, if you do not see that workbook here, if you just see all open workbooks, this workbook, and maybe some other file name, then that means you've not yet created a personal macro workbook. To do so, you would go and pull down the macros dialog box. You would click the Record Macro command. And in this case, you could call it Reset Workbook or Worksheet. Store it in the Personal Macro Workbook. Give it a description such as resets scroll bars, and then click OK. So that starts the macro recorder. We can then immediately turn off the macro recorder because the line of code we need cannot be recorded, it must be typed in there. So we'll click Stop Recording. So we then go back to our macros dialog box. Notice then here is Reset Worksheet. Now if we want to edit it, we would have to unhide the Personal Macro Workbook. Conversely, if we wanted to give it just create it the way that shows on the slide, we could just say Reset Worksheet and click Create. Now I would run into a conflict if I already have a macro with that name. Each macro name does have to be unique. but I'm just showing you that is how the create button would work. In fact, we'll just call this reset worksheet 2 so we can follow this through. We'll click create. So here is our macro we could just type in versus the macro that was created with the macro recorder. So normally, as we saw in part 2, we'd have to go and unhide the personal macro workbook, so we could then click the edit button. When we click create, we get put directly into the Visual Basic editor. So I have an extra macro here. I'm going to select and just remove it. So an easy way to clean up my macros is I can just go and select them and remove them from the module sheet there. Could then type in active sheet, used range. Doesn't matter if I mix the capitals or not. Press enter. It capitalizes everything. So at this point then we can close the Visual Basic Editor. Actually, before we do so, we want to either click the Save button here or go up and choose Save there. So either one, make sure that we save the Personal Macro Workbook. Then we can go and then close the Visual Basic Editor. So to set up our big sheet situation again, we'll go back to Z500 and we'll type our name. We'll go back up, we'll erase that cell. We're back to where we started. The scroll bars are compromised. This time though, and for any future workbooks, I can go to the macros button. I can click reset worksheet. I can choose run. And now the scroll bars are fixed. So that's how we can make it so that the macros, we can just run the macro instead of having to go dredge our brain saying, okay, what do we type to reset the worksheet? We can just formalize it into our Excel installation.